Welcome, friends. Tonight, we journey back more than 2,000 years to a time when the world seemed vast and unending, and a single young man set out to walk across it. Our story is not told in shouts of battle or clashing steel, but in the soft rhythm of hooves along dusty roads, in the glow of torches flickering in royal tents, and in the whisper of the sea against Mediterranean shores. This is the tale of Alexander of Macedon, known to history as Alexander the Great. He was born beneath omens of thunder and fire, taught by the greatest philosopher of his age, and grew to lead an army that marched farther than any before it. Yet beyond the victories and the cities that bore his name, there is a quieter story, one of ambition, of exhaustion, and of a legacy that lingers long after the man himself was gone. So, settle in. Let the noise of the day drift away. Together, we will follow Alexander's footsteps through marble palaces and across sunlit plains, from the mountains of Macedon to the edges of the known world, not with haste or fury, but gently, like a dream.
A birth in Pella. It is here, in the year 356 BC, that a child is to be born. His father is Philip II, the king of Macedon, a man of ferocious energy and brilliant military vision. Philip is a force of nature, a man who transformed his kingdom from a fractious backwater into the dominant military power in all of Greece. He is a pragmatic, one-eyed warrior, his body scarred from countless battles, his mind a sharp strategic instrument always focused on the next campaign, the next conquest. But on this night, he is away, expanding his empire, his presence felt only as a powerful, distant shadow. The child's mother is Olympias, the fourth wife of Philip, a princess from the neighboring kingdom of Epirus. She is a woman as different from her husband as night is from day. Where Philip is a man of the battlefield and the political assembly, Olympias is a creature of mystery and deep, fervent spirituality. She is a devout follower of the ecstatic cult of Dionysus, a world of torch-lit nocturnal rites, of serpents and wild music. It is said that she sleeps with snakes in her bed, not as pets, but as sacred companions, living emblems of the god she worships. She is a woman of intense passions, proud of her lineage, which she traces back to the mythical hero Achilles, the greatest warrior of the Trojan War. Her chamber in the palace feels like a place set apart, filled with the scent of incense and the quiet whisper of old legends.
On the night the child is born, the world seems to hold its breath, and omens fill the air. Legend says that a great thunderstorm broke over Pella, the heavens split by lightning without a drop of rain, as if Zeus himself were marking the arrival of a special soul. Far away, on the same day, the great temple of Artemis at Ephesus, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, burned to the ground. The story would later be told that the goddess Artemis was too preoccupied with attending the birth of this child to save her own temple. And messengers would bring news to Philip of other triumphs. His general Parmenion had won a major victory, and his horse had won a race at the Olympic Games. All these events, converging on a single day, were woven together into a tapestry of prophecy. It seemed the gods themselves were announcing that this was no ordinary birth. This child was destined for greatness, his life marked by fire and thunder from its very first moments. Inside the quiet palace, a son is born. He is named Alexander. He is the heir to a powerful throne, the son of a brilliant, ambitious king and a mystical, formidable queen. He is born into a world of conflict and contrast, the cold, calculating logic of his father's military ambitions and the wild spiritual intensity of his mother's faith. He will inherit Philip's strategic genius and Olympias's burning self-belief, her conviction that he is descended from heroes and touched by the gods. As he lies in his cradle in the silent palace of Pella, the world outside is unaware that a force has just been unleashed, a life that will blaze across the known world like a meteor, redrawing maps, toppling empires, and leaving a legacy so profound that his name will be whispered in awe for thousands of years to come. But for now, he is just a child, sleeping peacefully as the moon climbs high over the hills of Macedon.
Lessons from Aristotle. As the years passed in the palace at Pella, the young Prince Alexander grew. He was a boy of restless energy and a sharp, inquisitive mind, shaped by the two powerful forces of his parents. But King Philip knew that ambition and divine heritage were not enough to rule the world he envisioned. An heir needed more than just strength. He needed wisdom. And for the education of his extraordinary son, Philip sought out the greatest mind of the age. He sent a letter, not to a general or a politician, but to a philosopher. He invited Aristotle to come to Macedon. Imagine a quiet, secluded place, away from the noise and intrigue of the royal court. Philip established a school for his son and the children of other Macedonian nobles in a tranquil grove dedicated to the nymphs at Mysa. Picture a cluster of stone buildings nestled among shady plane trees, with cool colonnaded walkways and stone benches set by gentle streams. The air here is clean and still, filled only with the sound of rustling leaves, the murmur of water, and the quiet, measured voice of a teacher. This was Alexander's classroom, a world away from the barracks and the training grounds. Here, for 3 years, the future conqueror of the world would sit at the feet of the man who sought to conquer all of knowledge. Aristotle was not just a teacher, he was a revolutionary thinker who believed that the entire universe could be understood through reason, observation, and categorization. He brought with him not just ideas, but a way of seeing the world. Imagine the scrolls spread out on a wooden table, treatises on politics, ethics, logic, and rhetoric. Aristotle would have taught the young Alexander about the nature of virtue, the different forms of government, and the power of persuasive speech. He taught him that a good ruler must be more than just a strong warrior. He must be a man of reason and justice, capable of understanding the motivations of others, and of building a stable, well-ordered state.
But the lessons went far beyond politics. Aristotle was a passionate naturalist, and he instilled in his young student a deep and abiding curiosity about the world. He taught him biology, dissecting plants and animals to understand how they worked. He taught him astronomy, explaining the movements of the stars and planets. He taught him geography, unrolling maps that showed the known world, from the pillars of Heracles in the west to the distant, mysterious lands of Persia and India in the east. It was here, in this peaceful grove, that the seeds of Alexander's grand ambition may have been nourished. The world, as laid out by Aristotle, was not a fearful, unknown place, but a vast and fascinating system waiting to be explored, documented, and understood. Aristotle also introduced Alexander to the rich tapestry of Greek culture, most importantly, to the epic poems of Homer. He prepared a special annotated copy of the Iliad for his student, a copy that Alexander would treasure for the rest of his life. He kept it in a precious casket, and it is said he slept with it under his pillow, alongside a dagger. For Alexander, the Iliad was more than just a story. It was a handbook for heroes. He saw himself as a new Achilles, the legendary warrior his mother claimed as an ancestor. The poem taught him about glory, kleos, about honor, and about the eternal fame that could be won through great deeds.
It filled his mind with a yearning to live a life worthy of epic poetry, to perform acts so great that they would never be forgotten. In the quiet mornings at Mieza, under the tutelage of the great philosopher, two sides of Alexander's character were forged. Aristotle tempered the boy's passionate, almost violent ambition with the cool discipline of logic and reason. He gave him the intellectual tools to organize an empire, not just to conquer one. He cultivated a curiosity that would drive Alexander not just to defeat his enemies, but to learn from them, to collect exotic plants and animals, and to send reports back to his old teacher from the farthest reaches of his campaigns. The student would go on to live a life of action that was the very opposite of his teacher's life of contemplation. But the lessons learned in that quiet, sun-dappled grove would travel with him always, a steady, philosophical voice in the mind of the man who would set the world on fire.
The lion hunt. While Aristotle was shaping Alexander's mind, the rugged landscape of Macedon was shaping his body and his spirit. The kingdom was a wild place of forested mountains and swift rivers, a land where courage and physical prowess were as highly valued as any intellectual virtue. For the Macedonian nobility, the hunt was more than a sport. It was a school for war. It was where a young man learned to face danger, to track an opponent, to work with his companions, and to deliver a decisive killing blow. It was in the thrill of the chase, in the confrontation with a cornered beast, that a boy proved he had the heart of a man. Imagine a cool, misty morning in the Macedonian highlands. A party of horsemen, Alexander among them, moves through the dense woods. The air is crisp, the ground damp with dew. The only sounds are the soft thud of hoofs on the earth, the jingle of bridles, and the eager panting of the hunting dogs. They are searching for the most formidable prey the land has to offer. Not just wild boar or deer, but lions. At this time in history, a species of Asiatic lion still roamed the mountains of the Balkans, and to hunt one was the ultimate test of a warrior's courage. A boar could gore you, but a lion would hunt you back. It was a duel between a king of men and a king of beasts.
One famous story, recounted by later historians, tells of a hunt that nearly cost him his life. Alexander and his companions had cornered a massive lion. Instead of waiting for the others, Alexander spurred his horse forward, eager to claim the kill for himself. The lion, enraged and powerful, charged. In the ensuing chaos, Alexander was unseated, his horse rearing in terror. For a moment, the young prince was on the ground, vulnerable, with the lion poised to strike. It was only the swift action of one of his companions, a man named Craterus, who speared the beast at the last possible second, that saved his life. This event was so significant that it was later immortalized in a monumental bronze sculpture, commissioned to stand at the sacred site of Delphi. The sculpture depicted the scene in dramatic detail: the ferocious lion, the brave Craterus, and the young Alexander saved from the jaws of death. For most people, such a near-death experience would be a lesson in caution. For Alexander, it was something else entirely. It was a confirmation of his destiny. He had faced the ultimate danger and had been spared. It reinforced his belief that he was special, that he lived under the protection of the gods, and that glory was a prize worth risking everything for. These hunts were the practical application of his heroic ideals. They were his Iliad brought to life. He learned to read terrain, to anticipate an enemy's movements, and to keep his nerve in the face of mortal terror. He learned that hesitation could be fatal, and that true leadership meant sharing the same risks as his men. The scars he would accumulate on the battlefield were preceded by the scars of the hunt. It was in the wild mountains of his homeland, in the primal contest between man and beast, that Alexander the scholar began to transform into Alexander the warrior, his hands learning the feel of the spear,
his heart learning the intoxicating rhythm of the kill.
The horse named Bucephalus. The story of a great hero is often intertwined with the story of a great horse. For Achilles, there was the immortal Xanthos. For the legendary knights of romance, there were their faithful chargers. And for Alexander, there was Bucephalus. The tale of how he tamed this magnificent, untamable steed is one of the most enduring legends of his youth, a story that became a powerful symbol of his unique genius. It was an episode that seemed to prove, long before he ever commanded an army, that he possessed an almost supernatural ability to see what others could not, and to achieve what others deemed impossible. Imagine a dusty training ground near the palace in Pella, bathed in the bright Macedonian sun. A group of men are gathered, including King Philip and his court. A horse trader has brought a remarkable animal to show the king. The horse is a stunning creature, a large, powerful stallion of the finest Thessalian breed. His coat a glossy black, a large white star on his forehead. But his beauty is matched by his ferocity. He is wild, uncontrollable, rearing and bucking, his eyes rolling with terror and aggression. He will not let anyone near him, let alone on his back. His name, Bucephalus, means ox head, perhaps a reference to his broad forehead or to a brand mark on his flank. After several of the king's most experienced horsemen have tried and failed to mount the animal, Philip, frustrated and impatient, dismisses the horse as hopelessly vicious and orders the trader to take him away. As the men begin to lead the horse off, a young Alexander, perhaps only 12 or 13 years old, speaks up. He expresses his disappointment that such a fine horse should be lost simply because no one is skilled or brave enough to handle him. The older men laugh at his youthful arrogance, but Philip, perhaps amused, perhaps intrigued by his son's confidence, challenges him. He makes a wager with Alexander. If he can tame the horse, Philip will buy it for him. But if he fails, he must pay the full, exorbitant price of the horse himself. Alexander accepted the bet without hesitation, but he did not approach the horse with force or bravado. He approached it with intelligence. He had been watching carefully, and he had noticed something that everyone else had missed. The horse was not just vicious, it was afraid. Specifically, it seemed to be terrified of its own shadow, which danced and leapt on the ground before it. With a calm and quiet confidence, Alexander walked up to Bucephalus, took the reins, and gently turned the horse's head directly into the sun. Now, with the bright sun in his eyes, the horse could no longer see the frightening shadow that had been tormenting him. Alexander spoke to him in a soft, soothing voice, stroking his neck, calming the animal's fears. The wild bucking subsided. The horse grew still. Then, in a single, fluid motion, Alexander threw off his cloak and vaulted onto the horse's back. At first, Bucephalus tensed, but Alexander held him steady, not with brute force, but with a gentle, confident control. He let the horse break into a gallop, riding him across the plain and back, the two of them moving as one, a perfect picture of harmony and power. The court, which had been mocking just moments before, was now silent, then erupted in thunderous applause. King Philip is said to have wept with pride and joy. He came to his son as he dismounted, kissed him, and spoke the prophetic words, "My son, you must find a kingdom equal to your ambitions. Macedon is too small for you." He had seen in that moment more than just a boy taming a horse. He had seen a king. He had seen a mind capable of perceiving hidden patterns, of understanding fear, and of turning chaos into order, not through force, but through insight. Bucephalus would become Alexander's constant companion for the next 20 years. He would carry the king across the plains of Asia, through the thick of battle at Granicus, Issus, and Gaugamela.
The horse became a living legend, a symbol of Alexander's own spirit, proud, powerful, and loyal only to him. The story of their first meeting was told and retold throughout the ancient world, a perfect miniature of the greatness that was to come, a quiet moment on a dusty field that foretold the conquest of a world.
The prince becomes king. The relationship between Alexander and his father, Philip, was a complex storm of love, rivalry, pride, and resentment. Philip had forged the army and the kingdom that would be the tools of Alexander's conquests, but he also cast a long and intimidating shadow. As Alexander grew into a young man, a proven warrior and a popular commander in his own right, the tension between the reigning king and the impatient heir began to simmer. The court at Pella was a dangerous place, filled with political factions, ambitious nobles, and the constant intrigues of Philip's multiple wives. At the center of this web was the volatile relationship between Philip and Olympias, a situation that placed Alexander in an impossible position. The breaking point came at a wedding feast. Philip, in a move to secure a powerful Macedonian ally, had decided to take a new, younger wife, a noblewoman named Cleopatra Eurydice. This was a direct insult to Olympias and a potential threat to Alexander's succession, as any son born of this new, purely Macedonian union might be seen as a more legitimate heir than the son of an Epirote princess. Imagine the scene, a great hall in the palace, filled with drunken, feasting nobles. The air is thick with wine and tension. The bride's uncle, a general named Attalus, stands to offer a toast. In his drunken state, he raises his cup and prays that the union might produce a legitimate heir to the throne. The insult was unmistakable. Alexander, enraged, leaped to his feet. "You villain!" he shouted. "Am I then a bastard?" He hurled his goblet at Attalus. Chaos erupted. King Philip, his own judgment clouded by wine, drew his sword and lunged toward his son. But in his drunken fury, he stumbled and fell, collapsing in a heap on the floor. Alexander looked down at his father, the great conqueror of Greece, lying helpless on the ground. With a voice dripping with contempt, he said, "Here is the man who was preparing to cross from Europe to Asia, and he cannot even cross from one couch to another without falling." After this bitter and public humiliation, Alexander and his mother fled Macedon, going into a self-imposed exile.
Though they were eventually reconciled, the bond of trust between father and son was shattered. The stage was set for the final, tragic act. In the year 336 BC, the city of Aegae, the old capital of Macedon, was celebrating another royal wedding, this time for Alexander's sister. Philip, at the height of his power, was planning his great invasion of Persia. The celebration was meant to be a grand display of his wealth and authority. He entered the city's theater, dressed in a magnificent white robe, striding ahead of his bodyguards to show his people that he, beloved by the gods, had no need of them. It was in this moment of supreme confidence that a lone figure darted from the crowd. He was Pausanias, a young man from Philip's own bodyguard. He plunged a dagger deep into the king's side. Philip fell, his white robe stained with blood, and died almost instantly. The assassin tried to flee, but he was cornered and killed on the spot, his motives and any potential co-conspirators silenced forever. In the stunned chaos that followed, one figure moved with decisive clarity: the 20-year-old Alexander. Supported by his father's most powerful generals, Antipater and Parmenion, he was immediately presented to the army and hailed as the new king. His succession was swift and ruthless. He moved quickly to eliminate any and all potential rivals to the throne, including his young stepbrother and the family of Philip's last wife. The whispers and rumors began almost immediately.
Had he been involved in his father's assassination? What about his mother, the vengeful Olympias? History would never know for sure. What was certain was that the long shadow of King Philip was finally gone. Alexander was no longer the heir, waiting for a kingdom that was too small for him. He was now the king. The powerful army, the meticulously laid plans for the invasion of Asia, the burning ambition, it was all his. The prince was dead. The conqueror was born. The army of Macedonia. Let us now turn from the man to the extraordinary instrument he commanded. An army is more than a collection of soldiers. It is a living, breathing entity with its own rhythm, its own spirit, and its own sound. And the army Alexander inherited from his father was the most formidable military machine the world had ever seen. Imagine a vast, flat training ground in the cool light of early morning. The air is still, and then a sound begins. It is a low, rhythmic stamping, the sound of thousands of sandals hitting the earth in perfect unison. It is the sound of the Macedonian phalanx. This was the heart of the army, its solid, unbreakable core. Picture rows upon rows of men standing shoulder to shoulder, their bodies protected by bronze helmets and greaves, a round shield strapped to their left arm. But their true power lay in what they held in their hands. The sarissa. This was a spear of astonishing length, stretching 18 feet, far longer than any spear used by their opponents. It was too long and unwieldy for a single soldier, but when held by a disciplined phalanx, it transformed the unit into a terrifying, moving fortress of spear points. The first 5 ranks of men would level their sarissas, creating a dense thicket of sharpened bronze that was impenetrable to cavalry or infantry charges. To face a Macedonian phalanx was to face a monstrous, bristling hedgehog of death, a slow-moving, disciplined wall of destruction. But the phalanx, for all its defensive power, was a hammer, not a rapier. It was slow and inflexible. The genius of the Macedonian army lay in how it combined this unstoppable infantry corps with other, more mobile forces. The most elite of these were the companion cavalry. These were the sons of the Macedonian nobility, the friends and companions of the king himself, and they were the finest horsemen of the ancient world. Imagine them on their powerful Thessalian steeds, Alexander and his beloved Bucephalus at their head. They carried a shorter lance for charging and a sword for close combat. They were this surgical instrument of the army, the elite strike force that Alexander would personally lead in a wedge formation, smashing into the enemy's weak points at the decisive moment of battle.
Between the heavy infantry of the phalanx and the heavy cavalry of the companions were the hypaspists, the shield-bearers. They were an elite infantry unit, more lightly armed than the phalanx, carrying shorter spears and larger shields. This made them more versatile and mobile. They could protect the vulnerable flanks of the phalanx or move quickly to exploit a breakthrough created by the cavalry. They were the flexible hinge that connected the army's hammer to its anvil. And this was not all. The army was a complete war machine, supported by a corps of engineers who could build bridges and construct sophisticated siege engines, towers, catapults, and battering rams capable of bringing down the walls of the most fortified cities. There were archers from Crete, javelin throwers from Thrace, and light cavalry for scouting and screening. Every piece had its purpose, every soldier his role. It was a perfectly balanced system of combined arms, honed to a razor's edge by years of campaigning under King Philip. When this army marched, it was a city on the move. The quiet morning would be filled with the rhythmic tramp of feet, the clink of bronze, the creak of wagon wheels, and the low murmur of thousands of voices. It was the sound of an empire in motion. This was the instrument Alexander now held in his hand. He had not created it, but he understood its music better than anyone. He knew its strengths, its weaknesses, its rhythms, and its spirit. He would lead it not from the rear, like the Persian kings, but from the very front, sharing its dangers, earning its loyalty, and using it to carve his name across the face of the world. And with this perfect instrument of conquest at his back, Alexander turned his eyes east, to the narrow stretch of water that separated two worlds.
Crossing the Hellespont, the spring of 334 BC. Imagine standing on the shores of Europe, on the Gallipoli Peninsula, looking east across a narrow, placid stretch of water. This is the Hellespont, the modern-day Dardanelles, a strait that has for millennia served as the symbolic and strategic boundary between Europe and Asia. The water is a deep, tranquil blue, shimmering under the morning sun. The air is cool and smells of salt and damp earth. On the far shore, less than a mile away, lies the coast of Anatolia, the edge of the vast, formidable Persian Empire. It is a land of myth and legend, the very ground where the Trojan War was fought, a place that lives in the Greek imagination as a world of ancient wealth and despotic power. For Alexander, this was more than a military crossing. It was a profound symbolic act. He was not just moving an army, he was stepping into the pages of the Iliad. He was leading a new pan-Hellenic crusade, an act of retribution for the Persian invasions of Greece that had taken place a century and a half before. The ghosts of Marathon and Thermopylae were with him, their memory a powerful justification for the war he was about to unleash. The crossing itself was an act of masterful organization, but also of high ceremony. A fleet of 120 triremes, the sleek, three-banked warships of the Greek world, and numerous transport ships were assembled. One by one, they were loaded with the soldiers, the horses, and the supplies of the great army. Imagine the scene, the beaches bustling with activity, the shouted commands of officers, the nervous energy of the men, many of whom had never seen the sea before. They were leaving their homeland behind, embarking on a venture from which many would never return. Alexander himself did not cross with the main force. He took a single ship and steered it towards the center of the strait. There, in the middle of the Hellespont, he performed a solemn sacrifice. He poured a libation from a golden cup into the sea, a prayer to Poseidon, the god of the oceans, to grant him safe passage. He was asking for the blessing of the very elements he sought to master. As his ship approached the Asian shore, he put on his full suit of armor, the burnished bronze gleaming in the sun. Standing at the prow, he was the first to leap from the ship into the water, the first to set foot on the enemy continent. He drove his spear into the soil, claiming Asia for himself by right of the spear. It was a gesture of supreme, almost arrogant confidence. He was not asking for the land, he was taking it. His first act on Asian soil was to visit the site of ancient Troy. He was a pilgrim arriving at the most sacred shrine of his heroic faith. He ran naked, as was the custom, to the tomb believed to be that of his ancestor, Achilles, and placed a garland upon it. His closest friend, Hephaestion, did the same at the tomb of Patroclus, Achilles' beloved companion, a deliberate mirroring of their own deep bond. Alexander made sacrifices to the heroes of the Trojan War, both Greek and Trojan, seeking the favor of the spirits who haunted that legendary ground. He even took a set of sacred armor from the temple of Athena at Troy, which he would have carried before him in all his future battles. This was not mere superstition, it was a masterful piece of political and psychological theater.
by so publicly and passionately linking his own campaign to the most glorious epic of Greek history, he was elevating his invasion into something more than a war of conquest. It was a heroic quest, a fulfillment of destiny. He was telling his men and the world that he was not just Philip's son, he was the new Achilles, and they were the new Greek heroes, come to write a new and even greater epic. As the last of his soldiers waded ashore, the sun beginning to set over the Hellespont behind them, they were no longer just a Macedonian army. They were an army of destiny, standing on the edge of a vast and waiting continent.
The Battle of the Granicus. After landing in Asia, Alexander's army marched inland, their presence a direct challenge to Persian authority. The local Persian satraps, the governors of the region, quickly assembled their forces to meet this young invader and, they hoped, to crush his ambitions before they could take root. They chose their ground carefully, deciding to make their stand on the eastern bank of a small, fast-flowing river called the Granicus. Imagine the scene. It is late afternoon. The sun is low in the sky, casting long shadows across the landscape. The Macedonians arrive on the western bank to find the Persian army waiting for them. The river itself is not wide, but its banks are steep and muddy, and the current is strong. The Persian commanders had placed their cavalry, their best troops, right at the river's edge, creating a formidable defensive line. Their plan was simple and logical. They would let the Macedonians struggle across the river, and as the enemy soldiers tried to clamber, exhausted and disorganized, up the muddy bank, the Persian cavalry would charge down and destroy them piecemeal. It was a solid, conventional plan. Alexander's veteran general, Parmenion, a man of caution and experience, took one look at the situation and strongly advised against an immediate attack. He argued that it was too late in the day, that the river crossing was too dangerous, and that they should make camp and attack at dawn. It was the sensible, prudent advice of an old soldier. But Alexander was not a man of prudence. He was a man of momentum. He believed in shock, in speed, and in doing the unexpected. He looked at the Persian line and saw not a strength, but a fatal weakness. Their best troops, the cavalry, were at the front, but their less reliable infantry was positioned uselessly behind them. If he could break that front line of cavalry, the rest of the army might collapse. "I should be ashamed of myself," he is reported to have said, "if I crossed the Hellespont with ease, and this little trickle of a river holds me back." With his mind made up, he gave the order to attack. He would not wait for dawn. He would charge directly across the river, into the teeth of the waiting enemy. It was a moment of supreme, audacious risk. He placed himself at the head of the right wing, leading his elite companion cavalry, his white-plumed helmet making him an unmistakable target. He gave the signal, and with a great battle cry, plunged his horse into the cold, swirling water. The battle that followed was a chaotic, desperate struggle in the middle of the river and on its muddy banks. The Macedonians, fighting against the current and the treacherous footing, were at a severe disadvantage. Alexander himself was in the thick of the fighting, a whirlwind of furious energy. He was a prime target for the Persian nobles, who recognized him and sought the glory of killing the young king. His spear shattered, he fought with his sword. At one point, a Persian nobleman rode up behind him and brought his scimitar down in a mighty blow. It sliced through Alexander's helmet, shearing off his plume and grazing his scalp. Dazed, he was saved only by the quick action of one of his companions, Clytus the Black, who speared the attacker just as he was about to deliver a second fatal blow. Despite the desperate resistance, the disciplined Macedonian cavalry managed to establish a foothold on the far bank. Once they had solid ground beneath their horses' feet, their superior training and longer lances began to tell. They smashed into the Persian cavalry line, and it began to waver. Seeing their leaders fall and the Macedonian king fighting like a man possessed, the Persian cavalry broke and fled. The battle was not over, but it was decided.
The Persian infantry, leaderless and demoralized, was now exposed, and the Macedonian phalanx, having crossed the river, advanced upon them. The victory was swift and total. The river, which had run clear just hours before, was now, in the fading light of dusk, a quiet, flowing stream of red. Alexander had gambled, and he had won. His first great test in Asia was a resounding success, and the path into the heart of Persia was now open.
Gordian knot, the rope cut. After the victory at the Granicus, Alexander's army moved south, liberating the Greek cities along the coast of Anatolia from Persian rule. His reputation began to precede him, a growing legend of a young, invincible commander. As he marched inland, he came to the ancient city of Gordium, the former capital of the kingdom of Phrygia. Gordium was not a great military objective or a center of wealth, but it held something far more valuable: a prophecy. Imagine an old, weathered acropolis, a citadel standing on a hill overlooking the city. Inside, on public display, was a simple, rustic ox cart. This was said to be the cart of Gordius, the legendary founder of the city. Centuries before, so the story went, the Phrygians were without a king, and an oracle had told them that their next king would arrive in an ox cart. At that moment, Gordius, a poor peasant, had driven into the city square. He was immediately proclaimed king. In gratitude, he had dedicated his cart to the gods, and his son, the famous King Midas, had tied the yoke of the cart to a post with an incredibly intricate knot. The knot was made from the bark of a cornel tree, and it was so complex, its ends so cleverly hidden, that for generations no one had been able to untie it. Over time, a new prophecy had attached itself to the knot. Whoever could undo it would become the ruler of all Asia. When Alexander arrived in Gordium, he was naturally drawn to this challenge. It was a test perfectly suited to his temperament, a puzzle of destiny waiting to be solved. He entered the temple, surrounded by his curious generals and a crowd of local Phrygians. He stood before the ancient cart and examined the famous knot. He struggled with it for a time, turning it over, searching for a loose end, a key to its complex pattern. The crowd watched, a mixture of skepticism and anticipation in their eyes. Here was another great man, like so many before him, trying and failing to master the challenge of the gods. The knot resisted all his attempts. It was a tangled, seamless mass of hardened bark, its secrets locked away by time. It represented a problem that could not be solved by conventional means, a puzzle that defied traditional logic. Frustration began to mount. The prophecy seemed to be mocking him. But Alexander was not a man bound by convention. His mind, honed by Aristotle, was logical, but it was also capable of radical, lateral thinking. He had not come this far to be defeated by a piece of rope. What happened next became one of the most famous anecdotes of his life. After wrestling with the knot to no avail, he stepped back. A different kind of look came into his eyes. He declared, "It makes no difference how they are loosed," or so the story goes. He drew his sword. In a single, decisive motion, he sliced the knot in half with a powerful downward blow. The intricate puzzle, which had baffled the cleverest minds for centuries, fell apart in two pieces, its ancient secret revealed by the simple, brutal logic of a sharp edge. That night, the story says, a great thunderstorm broke over Gordium, a sign that the gods, particularly Zeus, approved of Alexander's unorthodox solution. The event was a powerful symbol. It announced to the world that a new kind of power had arrived, a power that did not play by the old rules. Alexander would not be constrained by the intricate problems of the past. He would cut through them. He was a man who would not untie the knots of diplomacy and tradition, but would sever them with the sword.
The prophecy was fulfilled, not by cleverness, but by audacity. As he marched away from Gordium, leaving the sundered knot behind, he carried with him the divine sanction of destiny. Asia, the prophecy had promised, would be his, and he had just shown the world precisely how he intended to claim it.
The Siege of Tyre. Having secured Anatolia, Alexander marched south along the Mediterranean coast, his goal to neutralize the formidable Persian navy. The key to Persian sea power was its naval bases in the coastal cities of Phoenicia. Most of these cities, seeing the tide of history turning, surrendered to him without a fight. But one city, the proud and wealthy island fortress of Tyre, refused. Imagine a city that seems to rise directly from the sea. Tyre was built on an island about half a mile offshore, a great hub of commerce protected by the deep water of the Mediterranean and by massive, formidable walls that were said to be 150 feet high in places. The Tyrians were masters of the sea, and they felt secure on their island. They were willing to be Alexander's allies, but they would not allow him to enter their city to make a sacrifice in their temple, an act which would have symbolized his lordship over them. They were defiant, confident that their walls and their fleet would keep them safe from the land-based Macedonian army. They had withstood sieges before, one lasting for 13 years. They believed they could outlast this young king as well. For Alexander, this defiance was an unacceptable challenge to his authority and a major strategic threat. He could not march on to Egypt or into the heart of Persia, leaving this powerful, unsubdued naval base at his back. He resolved to take the city, no matter the cost. But how could a land army capture an island fortress? Alexander's solution was as audacious as his solution to the Gordian knot. If he could not sail to the city, he would bring the land to the city. He commanded his engineers to build a causeway, a great stone mole, across the half-mile of sea that separated the island from the mainland. The siege of Tyre, which lasted for 7 months, was one of the most remarkable feats of military engineering in the ancient world. Imagine the scene. Thousands of soldiers, now laborers, felling trees from the mountains of Lebanon, quarrying stone, and driving wooden piles into the seabed. Day after day, week after week, they toiled, slowly pushing a roadway out into the sea, a finger of land pointing towards the defiant city. The work was slow, difficult, and incredibly dangerous.
The Tyrians did everything they could to stop them. Their warships would sail out and fire arrows and projectiles at the exposed workers. Their divers would swim underwater and pull apart the wooden foundations of the causeway. In one famous incident, the Tyrians loaded an old ship with flammable materials like pitch and sulfur, set it on fire, and steered the great floating inferno directly into the head of the causeway, destroying months of work in a single afternoon. Any other commander might have given up. The task seemed impossible, but Alexander's resolve only hardened. He started again, this time building an even wider causeway, one large enough to support protective siege towers. He also set about building his own fleet, gathering ships from the other Phoenician cities that had surrendered to him, as well as from Cyprus and Rhodes. Eventually, he assembled a fleet of over 200 ships, blockading Tyre by sea and protecting his construction work. The final assault was a combined operation. With the causeway finally reaching the island's walls, great siege towers, some as tall as the walls themselves, were rolled forward. Catapults bombarded the defenders. From the sea, ships with battering rams pounded at the base of the walls. After months of relentless effort, a section of the wall crumbled. Alexander, as always, led the charge himself, fighting his way into the city. The fighting inside the city was brutal and merciless.
The Tyrians, who had resisted for so long, were shown no pity. Thousands were killed in the fighting. The city that had for so long been the proud queen of the sea was now a scene of utter devastation. The survivors, some 30,000 men, women, and children, were sold into slavery. The siege was over. Alexander had done the impossible. He had conquered the unconquerable city, not with a navy, but with sheer, relentless, indomitable will. He had turned an island into a peninsula, a feat of engineering so profound that the geography of the coast was permanently changed, and remains so to this day.
Meeting Darius at Issus. With the coast secured, Alexander turned his army inland, seeking a decisive confrontation with the main Persian army and its leader, the great king Darius III himself. Darius, having gathered a vast force from all corners of his empire, was also seeking a battle, confident that his overwhelming numbers would crush the young Macedonian invader. The two armies moved towards each other like two storm fronts, destined to collide. The clash came in the autumn of 333 BC, near a town called Issus, on a narrow coastal plain in what is now southern Turkey. Imagine the terrain, a thin strip of flat land squeezed between the mountains on one side and the Mediterranean Sea on the other. It was a place of strategic importance, but the narrowness of the plain would have a profound and unexpected effect on the battle to come. Darius had managed to maneuver his army behind Alexander's, cutting off the Macedonian supply lines. He had Alexander trapped. He chose his ground on this narrow plain, believing it was the perfect place to deploy his huge army. But in this, he made a catastrophic error. The plain was too narrow. It acted as a bottleneck, preventing him from bringing his vast numerical superiority to bear. His massive force was compressed, its flanks protected by the sea and the mountains, but also unable to expand to envelop the smaller Macedonian force. He had inadvertently chosen a battlefield that perfectly suited Alexander's smaller, more disciplined army. The two armies drew up for battle. The Macedonians, looking across the field, would have seen a terrifying sight, a seemingly endless sea of soldiers, a force that outnumbered them by at least 2-1. At the center of the Persian line, resplendent in his magnificent war chariot, surrounded by his elite guard of 10,000 immortals, was Darius himself. It was a sight designed to inspire awe and terror. The battle began. The Macedonian phalanx moved forward with its slow, inexorable rhythm. The fighting was fierce, especially on the Macedonian left wing, where Parmenion's troops were hard-pressed by the Persian cavalry. But Alexander, as always, was focused on a single objective. He was not just trying to win a battle, he was trying to decapitate the Persian Empire. His goal was Darius. He gathered his elite companion cavalry on the right wing, and at the opportune moment, when a gap opened in the Persian line, he led them in a ferocious, decisive charge, aimed like a spear directly at the heart of the enemy army, at the chariot of the great king. The charge was a whirlwind of desperate, close-quarters fighting. Alexander and his companions smashed through the lines of Persian guards, cutting a bloody path towards their quarry. Darius, from his high chariot, watched in horror as this unstoppable wedge of Macedonian horsemen, led by the demonic young king himself, broke through his elite troops and came directly for him. He saw the fury in Alexander's eyes, the determination of a man who would stop at nothing, and in that moment, the courage of the great king failed him. Panicked, Darius turned his war chariot and fled the battlefield, seeking his own personal safety. The sight of the king's empty chariot and the news of his flight spread like wildfire through the Persian ranks. An army whose loyalty is focused on a single absolute monarch cannot stand when that monarch abandons them. The Persian line, which had been fighting bravely, now collapsed into a chaotic, desperate rout.
The soldiers, leaderless and demoralized, threw down their weapons and ran, trying to escape the narrow confines of the plain. The retreat became a horrific slaughter, as the Macedonians pursued them, cutting them down by the thousands.
The gifts of Egypt. After the stunning victory at Issus, the path to the south lay open. Alexander chose not to pursue the fugitive Darius into the heart of Persia just yet. Instead, he continued his strategy of securing the entire Mediterranean coast, and that meant marching towards the oldest and most mysterious land in the ancient world, Egypt. For centuries, Egypt had been a restive, unwilling province of the Persian Empire. The Egyptians resented their Persian overlords, who they saw as foreign oppressors who had no respect for their ancient gods and traditions. As Alexander and his army marched across the Sinai Desert and arrived at the borders of Egypt in 332 BC, they were not met with resistance. They were welcomed as liberators. Imagine the scene. The Macedonian army, weary from the siege of Gaza, entering the ancient land of the Nile. Instead of drawn swords and fortified cities, they're greeted by cheering crowds. The Persian satrap of Egypt, seeing no hope of resisting, wisely surrendered the entire country without a fight. The treasuries, the granaries, the whole vast wealth of Egypt was handed over to Alexander. For Alexander, this was a moment of profound significance. He was not just a conqueror here, he was a restorer of a rightful order. He showed an immediate and deep respect for the ancient Egyptian religion and customs. This was not just a political tactic, it seemed to be a genuine expression of his own deep-seated curiosity and piety. He traveled to the ancient capital of Memphis, where, in a grand ceremony, he was crowned Pharaoh of Egypt. Picture him in the great temple of Ptah, participating in the ancient sacred rites, accepting the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt. For the Egyptian priests and people, this was a powerful sign. Here was a ruler who honored their gods, a legitimate pharaoh in a way the Persian kings had never been.
But Alexander's journey into the spiritual heart of Egypt was not yet complete. He was drawn by a powerful urge to visit a remote and famous oracle in the middle of the vast Libyan desert. He embarked on a long and dangerous journey, leading a small select group across hundreds of miles of waterless wasteland to the Siwa oasis. This was the home of the oracle of the god Amun, a ram-headed deity whom the Greeks identified with their own king of the gods, Zeus. To visit this oracle was to seek a direct audience with his divine father. The journey itself was a trial, a pilgrimage through a sea of sand. The party reportedly ran out of water and was saved only by a sudden, miraculous rainstorm. They became lost and were guided, according to the legends, by two talking crows or snakes sent by the gods. When they finally arrived at the tranquil, palm-fringed oasis, a green jewel in the barren desert, Alexander went alone into the inner sanctum of the temple to consult the high priest. No one knows for certain what was said in that secret consultation, but when Alexander emerged, his expression was one of serene satisfaction. According to the reports, the high priest had greeted him not as a mortal, but as the son of Amun. When Alexander asked if he had punished all of his father Philip's murderers, the priest told him that his true father could not be harmed by any man. And when he asked if he would conquer the world, the answer was yes. Whether this was a genuine divine pronouncement or a clever priest telling a powerful new ruler what he wanted to hear, it had a profound effect on Alexander. He left Siwa with his own deepest convictions confirmed. He was not merely the son of Philip, he was the son of a god. This belief would shape his actions and his perception of himself for the rest of his life. He had arrived in Egypt as a conqueror and a liberator, but he would leave as a pharaoh
and a living God, his destiny affirmed by the ancient whispering sands of the desert.
Alexandria by the Sea. During his time in Egypt, Alexander made a decision that would become one of his most enduring and important legacies, a creation that would outlast his empire and shine as a beacon of culture and learning for nearly 1,000 years. He decided to found a new city. He was not content merely to rule the ancient cities of Egypt. He wanted to place his own permanent mark upon this land. He chose a site on the Mediterranean coast, a narrow strip of land between the sea and a large freshwater lake, a location with access to both the maritime trade of the Mediterranean and the rich agricultural heartland of the Nile. Imagine Alexander standing on this windswept stretch of coastline. With him are his architects and engineers. There is no city here yet, only a small fishing village. But Alexander, with his strategic and visionary mind, can see the potential. He sees a great harbor, a crossroads of commerce and culture, a city that would link his new European empire with the ancient world of Africa and the vast lands of Asia he had yet to conquer. He himself is said to have laid out the general plan for the city. According to one story, when they had no chalk to mark out the lines for the streets, he used barley flour from the soldiers' rations, tracing the grid of a great metropolis in the sand. And as he did so, a great flock of birds descended from the sky and ate the flour, an omen that his advisors feared was negative, but which Alexander interpreted as a sign that his new city would one day provide sustenance for the entire world. He named the city, with his characteristic lack of modesty, Alexandria. It would be the first and the greatest of the many cities he would found and name after himself across his sprawling empire. His vision for Alexandria was not just for a military garrison or a trading post. He planned it as a magnificent Greek polis, a center of Hellenistic civilization on Egyptian soil. He designed a city with wide, regular streets set out in a grid pattern, with grand temples, a royal palace, a marketplace, and residential quarters. He also planned for it to be a city of diverse peoples, encouraging his Greek and Macedonian soldiers to settle there alongside the native Egyptians, creating a new cosmopolitan culture.
Though Alexander would not live to see his creation in its full glory, his vision was realized with breathtaking success by his successors, with Ptolemies, who would rule Egypt for the next 300 years. They made Alexandria their capital and turned it into the most spectacular city of the Hellenistic world. At the entrance to its great harbor, they built a monumental lighthouse, the Pharos of Alexandria, a tower so tall that its light was visible for miles out at sea, becoming one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. But the true heart of Alexandria was not its lighthouse or its harbor, but its great library and its associated Mausion, or Temple of the Muses. This was a revolutionary institution, a center for research and scholarship that was the first of its kind. The Ptolemies, inspired by the spirit of intellectual curiosity that Alexander had inherited from Aristotle, set out to collect all the knowledge of the world under one roof. They sent agents across the globe to buy or copy every scroll they could find. Ships docking in Alexandria were required to surrender any books they had on board to be copied for the library. For centuries, the Library of Alexandria was the intellectual center of the universe. The greatest minds of the age came here to study and to work. It was here that Euclid wrote his Elements of Geometry, that Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the earth with astonishing accuracy, that the Hebrew Bible was first translated into Greek. It was a place where Greek philosophy, Egyptian history, Babylonian astronomy, and Jewish theology could all be studied side by side. The city that Alexander traced in the sand became a crucible of ideas, a melting pot of cultures, and the living embodiment of the Hellenistic world he was helping to create. It was a legacy of light, learning, and knowledge that would shine long after his conquests had faded into memory.
The Battle of Gaugamela. Having secured Egypt and the entire eastern Mediterranean, Alexander could no longer delay the final decisive confrontation. In the spring of 331 BC, he marched his army out of Egypt, crossed the great rivers Tigris and Euphrates, and pushed deep into the heartland of the Persian Empire. The fugitive King Darius, in the 2 years since his defeat at Issus, had not been idle. He had scoured the eastern provinces of his vast empire, from Babylonia to India, and had assembled a new and even more terrifying army. This time, he would not be trapped in a narrow plain. He would choose his own ground, a place where his overwhelming numbers could be brought to bear. This was to be the final contest, the battle that would decide the fate of Asia. The two armies met on a wide, flat plain near a village called Gaugamela. Imagine the scene at dawn on the day of the battle. The Macedonian army, numbering perhaps 47,000 men, looks out across a plain that is teeming with the enemy. The Persian force is a breathtaking sight, a multi-ethnic host of over 200,000 soldiers, according to some ancient sources. Darius had assembled the full might of his empire: Scythian horsemen from the steppes, Indian infantry, Babylonian archers, and at the center, the most fearsome weapon in his arsenal: 200 scythed chariots designed to plow through the Macedonian phalanx, their wheels fitted with long, sharp blades. To ensure the ground was perfect for his chariots, Darius had even had the plain leveled and cleared of obstacles. Facing this overwhelming force, Alexander's veteran general Parmenion once again advised caution, suggesting a night attack to surprise and confuse the massive enemy host. But Alexander rejected the idea with the famous line, "I will not steal my victory."
He arranged his army in a brilliant and unorthodox formation. Anticipating that the Persians would try to envelop his smaller force, he arranged his flanks at an oblique angle, creating a sort of open rectangle with a second line of infantry in reserve, ready to swing around and face any attack from the rear. It was a formation of immense flexibility and tactical depth. The battle began with the charge of the scythed chariots. It was meant to be the decisive, terrifying opening move, but Alexander was prepared. He ordered his front ranks to open up, creating channels through which the chariots could pass harmlessly. The soldiers, with incredible discipline, sidestepped the charging vehicles, hurling javelins at the horses and drivers. The great chariot charge, which was supposed to shatter the Macedonian line, fizzled out into a chaotic failure. Now the main battle was joined. As Alexander had predicted, the vast Persian line began to sweep forward, trying to outflank and surround his army. This created the very opportunity he had been waiting for. As the Persian left wing overextended itself, a gap opened up near the center of their line. This was the moment. Just as he had done at Issus, Alexander gathered his companion cavalry into their famous wedge formation and led a charge directly at that gap, aiming once again for the position of Darius himself. The fighting was desperate. Alexander and his men carved their way through the Persian defenses, a spearhead of unstoppable force. Darius, watching from his chariot, saw history repeating itself. The same terrifying young king, the same wedge of elite horsemen, was once again breaking through his lines, coming for him personally. And once again, Darius panicked. For the second and final time, the great king of Persia turned his chariot and fled the field of battle. His flight was the signal for a total collapse. The vast, diverse army, held together only by the presence of the king, disintegrated. The Battle of Gaugamela turned into a rout,
a testament to Alexander's tactical genius, the discipline of his soldiers, and the fatal weakness at the heart of the Persian command structure. The victory was absolute. There would be no third army, no second chance for Darius. The Persian Empire, which had dominated the world for over 2 centuries, had been broken beyond repair on the plains of Gaugamela.
Babylon opens its gates. With the Persian army shattered and Darius a fugitive hiding in the eastern mountains, the great cities of the Persian heartland now lay defenseless before Alexander. The first and greatest of these was Babylon, a city whose name alone conjured images of immense wealth, ancient power, and legendary wonders. It was one of the largest and most magnificent cities in the world, the jewel of Mesopotamia, famous for its towering ziggurat, its massive walls, and its fabled hanging gardens. As Alexander and his victorious army approached the city, they did not prepare for a siege, they prepared for a triumphal procession. The Persian satrap of Babylon, Mazaeus, who had fought bravely at Gaugamela, saw the futility of further resistance. He rode out to meet Alexander and surrendered the city to him peacefully. Imagine the scene of Alexander's entry into Babylon. It is not the entry of a conqueror, but of a king returning to his capital. The road leading to the city is strewn with flowers and garlands. Great silver altars burning with incense line the route, filling the air with fragrant smoke. The people of Babylon, weary of Persian rule and eager to win the favor of their new master, throng the streets, cheering and singing. He is met by the city's priests, its nobles, and its officials, all offering him the keys to the city and the vast treasures stored within its palace. Alexander entered the city through the magnificent Ishtar Gate, its walls of brilliant blue-glazed brick decorated with lions and dragons. He rode in a great war chariot, his army marching behind him in perfect formation, a display of disciplined power designed to awe the populace. He was led to the royal palace, the very place from which the great Persian kings had once ruled the world. Here he took his seat on the throne of Darius. The symbolism was immense. The young king from the provincial backwater of Macedon was now the master of the most ancient and storied city on earth.
As he had done in Egypt, Alexander acted not as a foreign conqueror, but as a legitimate successor. He showed immediate and profound respect for Babylonian culture and religion. One of his first acts was to order the restoration of the temples that had been neglected or damaged by the Persians, particularly the great temple of Esagila, the house of the city's patron god Marduk. This act earned him the gratitude and loyalty of the powerful Babylonian priesthood, who officially proclaimed him King of Babylon, King of Asia, King of the 4 quarters of the world. For a month, the army rested in Babylon, enjoying the city's luxurious comforts after the hardships of the campaign. It was a time of feasting and celebration. But for Alexander, it was also a time of consolidation. He appointed the Persian satrap Mazaeus to continue as the governor of the province, a clever move that showed he was willing to incorporate former enemies into his new administration. He began to envision a new kind of empire, one that was not just a Greek or Macedonian conquest, but a fusion of East and West. But even as he sat in the splendors of Babylon, his mind was already on the move. He had taken the capital, but the Persian king, Darius, was still at large. And further to the east lay the other great Persian capitals of Susa, Persepolis, and Ecbatana, filled with the accumulated wealth of generations. The heart of the empire was his, but its spirit was not yet fully broken. After a month of rest and celebration, the army was ready to march again. The torches were lit, the gates of Babylon were opened, and Alexander led his men out into the night, heading east towards the final remnants of Persian power.
The treasures of Persepolis. From Babylon, the army marched on, first to Susa, another great Persian capital, which surrendered without a fight,
yielding up a staggering amount of treasure. But Alexander's ultimate goal was the symbolic and spiritual heart of the Persian Empire, the great ceremonial capital of Persepolis. This was not a city in the conventional sense. It was a magnificent, sprawling palace complex built on a massive stone terrace nestled at the foot of a mountain. It was the place where the Persian kings held their grandest ceremonies, received tribute from all corners of their empire, and were finally laid to rest in rock-cut tombs carved into the nearby cliffs. To take Persepolis was to extinguish the very soul of the Achaemenid dynasty. Imagine the approach to this majestic place. After a hard-fought battle to clear the mountain pass known as the Persian Gates, Alexander and his army descended onto the plain and saw the Great Terrace for the first time. It must have been a breathtaking sight. A forest of towering columns, vast audience halls, and monumental staircases decorated with intricate relief carvings depicting the peoples of the empire bringing gifts to the great king. It was a symphony in stone, a testament to the immense power and wealth of the empire he had just conquered. Alexander entered the city and took possession of the greatest treasure hoard in the ancient world. The sheer amount of gold, silver, and other riches stored at Persepolis was almost beyond comprehension. The ancient historians report that it took thousands of mules and camels to carry it all away. Alexander and his men wandered through the vast halls, marveling at the luxury and artistry. For a time, Alexander seemed to treat the city with respect, sitting on the royal throne of Persia and contemplating the fall of great empires.
But a dark and controversial chapter was about to unfold. After several weeks of resting in the city, a great victory feast was held in the palace. Imagine the scene. A vast hall filled with the victorious Macedonian officers, drinking heavily, celebrating their triumph. The torches cast flickering shadows on the carved walls. As the night wore on and the wine flowed freely, the mood began to change. According to one popular account, a woman named Thais, an Athenian courtesan who was the companion of Alexander's general Ptolemy, stood up and gave a speech. She declared that it would be a glorious act to burn down the palace of the kings who had once burned down the city of Athens. It would be a fitting revenge, an act of symbolic retribution carried out on behalf of all of Greece. Her words, spoken into the drunken, testosterone-fueled atmosphere, ignited a spark. The idea spread like wildfire. The men, their passions inflamed by wine and victory, cheered in agreement. Alexander himself, perhaps caught up in the moment, perhaps seeing a brutal political logic in the act, agreed. He leapt to his feet and declared that he would lead them. A wild, drunken procession formed with soldiers grabbing torches. Alexander, with Thais at his side, was the first to hurl his flaming torch into the magnificent hall of Xerxes, the very king who had been responsible for the destruction of Athens. The fire spread with terrifying speed, consuming the priceless cedarwood roofs, the rich tapestries, and the intricate furnishings. The great palace complex became a monstrous funeral pyre. The flames would have been visible for miles, a terrible beacon in the night sky announcing the final, brutal end of the Persian Empire. Historians have debated the act ever since. Was it a spontaneous act of drunken passion, as some sources suggest? Or was it a cold, calculated act of state policy? A deliberate signal to the rest of Asia that the old dynasty was gone forever and that any resistance was futile. Did Alexander regret it the next morning, as some claim? We will never know for certain, but the result was the same. The magnificent palace of Persepolis, one of the wonders of the ancient world, was reduced to a blackened, silent ruin. The heart of Persia was not just captured, it was turned to ash.
The march through Bactria. After the destruction of Persepolis, the war should have been over. Alexander was the undisputed master of the Persian Empire. But one piece of business remained: the fugitive king, Darius. Alexander set off in pursuit, a high-speed chase through the rugged mountains of what is now northern Iran. But he would not get the satisfaction of capturing his rival alive. Darius was betrayed by one of his own satraps, a man named Bessus, who had him arrested and then, as Alexander's forces closed in, had him murdered, leaving his body on the side of the road. Alexander found his great enemy dead. He covered the body with his own cloak, a gesture of respect for a fallen king, and sent it back to Persepolis for a royal burial. With Darius dead, Bessus now proclaimed himself the new king of Persia and retreated into the wild, remote eastern provinces of the empire, Bactria and Sogdiana. This was a land of extremes, a region of soaring, snow-capped mountains and scorching deserts, roughly corresponding to modern-day Afghanistan and Uzbekistan. For Alexander, the fight was not over. He could not allow a usurper to claim the throne he now considered his own. And so began one of the most difficult and grueling campaigns of his entire career, a 3-year war at the edge of the known world. Imagine the landscape. The army is no longer marching through the fertile plains of Mesopotamia or the gentle hills of Anatolia. They are in a harsh, alien world. They climb through treacherous mountain passes, the air thin and cold, the snow deep on the ground. They cross vast, sun-baked deserts where water is scarce and the heat is punishing. The enemy they face here is not a conventional army that will meet them in a set-piece battle. This is a land of fierce, independent warlords and mountain tribes who wage a brutal guerrilla war. They launch surprise raids and then melt back into the rugged terrain they know so well. This was a new kind of fighting for the Macedonian army, and it tested their discipline and their loyalty to the limit. The soldiers, far from home, began to grumble. They had conquered the Persian Empire. They were rich beyond their wildest dreams. Why were they now fighting and dying in this desolate, forgotten corner of the world? The morale of the army, for the first time, began to fray.
It was during this campaign that Alexander's own character began to show signs of change. The pressures of command, the constant danger, and his own growing belief in his divinity were taking their toll. He began to adopt some of the customs of the Persian court, wearing Persian dress and introducing the practice of proskynesis, the act of bowing or prostrating oneself before the king. For the Persians, this was a normal sign of respect, but for the fiercely independent Greeks and Macedonians, it was an act reserved for the gods alone. They saw it as a sign that their king was becoming a tyrant, an oriental despot. This cultural clash led to the darkest episodes of Alexander's life. In a drunken argument, he killed his old companion, Clytus the Black, the very man who had saved his life at the Battle of the Granicus, after Clytus had accused him of forgetting his Macedonian roots. Alexander was immediately consumed with a profound and crippling remorse, but the deed was done. Later, a conspiracy against his life was uncovered among his royal pages, leading to a series of paranoid accusations and executions, including that of the son of his veteran general Parmenion. Alexander, fearing the father would seek revenge, sent assassins to have Parmenion killed as well, a cold and ruthless act against the man who had helped put him on the throne. Despite the hardships and the growing darkness in his own soul, Alexander eventually succeeded. Through relentless campaigning, establishing new cities, more Alexandrias, as military outposts, and a clever mix of force and diplomacy, he finally captured and executed Bessus. He had pacified the region, pushed the boundaries of his empire to the Jaxartes River, and secured his claim as the rightful king of Asia. But the cost had been high. The easy victories were over. The long, brutal march through Bactria had tested the limits of his army and had begun to reveal the cracks in the character of the conqueror himself.
Love and marriage in Susa. After the brutal campaigns in Bactria and Sogdiana, Alexander finally secured the region, partly through force and partly through a strategic marriage. He fell in love with and married Roxana, the beautiful daughter of a local Sogdian chieftain. It was a love match, by all accounts, but it was also a brilliant political move, helping to reconcile the rebellious eastern provinces to his rule. With the far eastern frontier of the old Persian Empire finally under his control, Alexander began to think about the long journey back towards the center of his new vast domain. But his vision for the empire had evolved. He no longer saw it as a simple Macedonian conquest of Persia. He now dreamed of something far more radical, a true fusion of the two cultures, a blending of East and West. He envisioned a new ruling class, a partnership between his victorious Macedonians and the old Persian nobility. He wanted to create a single unified empire, not just politically, but culturally. To achieve this, he staged one of the most extraordinary events of his reign, the great mass wedding at the city of Susa in 324 BC. Imagine the scene in the grand palace of Susa. A magnificent pavilion has been erected, large enough to hold thousands of guests. Inside, there are 100 couches draped in silver and rich fabrics. Alexander himself is to be married again, this time to a daughter of the former king Darius. His closest friend, Hephaestion, is to marry another of Darius's daughters. But this is not just about the ting. 80 of Alexander's most senior officers and generals are also to be married, all on the same day, to the daughters of the most powerful and influential Persian noble families. The ceremony was conducted according to Persian custom. The grooms sat on their couches, and the brides were brought in. As each bride entered, her new husband would stand, take her by the hand, and kiss her, a gesture that sealed the union. It was a breathtaking piece of political theater, a symbolic and literal merging of the ruling elites of Europe and Asia. But the weddings did not stop there. To encourage this fusion throughout the army, Alexander announced that he would pay the dowry for any of his common soldiers who chose to marry a local woman. It is said that over 10,000 Macedonian soldiers took him up on the offer, their unions also celebrated as part of this grand festival of unity.
The festivities lasted for 5 days. There were lavish feasts, musical performances by the most famous artists of the age, and athletic contests. Alexander paid off all the debts of his soldiers, a gesture of immense generosity that further endeared him to his men. The whole event was a carefully orchestrated spectacle designed to promote his policy of fusion. He was trying to build a bridge between two worlds, to create a new hybrid culture that would be the foundation of his empire. However, the policy was not universally popular, especially among the proud and ethnocentric Macedonians. Many of them looked upon these events with suspicion and resentment. They had conquered the Persians. Why were they now being asked to act like them? They saw Alexander's adoption of Persian dress, his use of Persian courtiers, and now this mass marriage as a betrayal of their Macedonian identity. They felt that their king was drifting away from them, becoming something foreign, something other. This simmering resentment would soon boil over, but for a few days in Susa, under the silken canopies of the wedding pavilion, Alexander's dream of a united world seemed possible. It was a moment of hope, a celebration of love and unity, a bold attempt to join two great civilizations not by the sword, but by the hand.
The Indian Campaign.
Even after conquering the vast Persian Empire, from the shores of the Aegean to the mountains of Afghanistan, Alexander's ambition was not satisfied. The world as he knew it from the maps and teachings of his youth stretched even further to the east. Beyond the great mountain range of the Hindu Kush lay the fabled land of India, a place of immense wealth, strange beasts, and powerful kingdoms. For Alexander, driven by his insatiable pathos, or yearning for the unknown, this was an irresistible challenge. He believed that if he could conquer India, he would reach the great outer ocean that was thought to encircle the entire world. He would have conquered everything. He would have reached the end. In the summer of 327 BC, he led his army, now a seasoned and multi-ethnic force of Macedonians, Greeks, and Asian recruits, over the formidable passes of the Hindu Kush and descended into the plains of the Punjab, in what is now modern-day Pakistan. They had entered a new world, a land unlike anything they had ever seen before. Imagine the sensory overload for these soldiers from the Mediterranean. The air is thick with a heavy, tropical humidity. The landscape is a lush, vibrant green, a tangle of dense jungles and wide, powerful rivers. The heat is oppressive. And then there are the monsoons, torrential downpours that turn the ground to mud and swell the rivers into impassable torrents. The peoples and cultures they encountered were just as alien. They met gymnosophists, or naked philosophers, holy men who lived simple, ascetic lives of contemplation, a concept that fascinated the intellectually curious Alexander. He engaged in long philosophical discussions with them, a brief respite of the mind in the midst of a military campaign. But not all of India was so peaceful. The region was a patchwork of warring kingdoms and fierce, independent tribes who were not about to submit to a foreign invader.
The campaign in India became a series of difficult and bloody sieges against fortified towns and mountain strongholds. The fighting was some of the most brutal of Alexander's entire career. At the siege of one town, he was so enraged by the stubborn resistance that when the city finally fell, he ordered every single inhabitant to be put to the sword. He himself was constantly in the thick of the fighting, his body accumulating more and more wounds. In one assault, while scaling a city wall, he was struck in the chest by an arrow that pierced his lung, a wound so severe that his men at first thought he had been killed. But the most terrifying new element of warfare they encountered was the Indian war elephant. Imagine the sight for a Macedonian soldier, a creature the size of a small building, its skin thick as armor, its tusks fitted with iron spikes, charging towards them with a trumpeting war, a tower full of archers on its back. These were the living tanks of the ancient world, and they struck a primal terror into the hearts of both the soldiers and their horses. Despite the hardships, the strange climate, and the fierce resistance, Alexander's tactical genius and the discipline of his army prevailed. He pushed deeper and deeper into the Punjab, winning battle after battle, conquering kingdom after kingdom. He had crossed the great Indus River and was now heading towards the Ganges, the heart of the Indian subcontinent. He believed he was close to his goal, close to the edge of the world. But the world was proving to be much larger than he had ever imagined, and the spirits of his men, unlike his own, were not limitless.
The Battle of the Hydaspes. The culmination of the Indian campaign and the last of Alexander's great set-piece battles took place on the banks of a wide, swollen river called the Hydaspes, the modern Jhelum. On the far side of the river, a powerful local king named Porus had gathered his army to block Alexander's advance. Porus was a formidable opponent, a man of immense physical stature and renowned courage, and his army was a strong one, featuring a large contingent of the terrifying war elephants. Imagine the scene. It is the monsoon season of 326 BC. The river is a raging, muddy torrent.
swollen by the relentless rains. Alexander's army is camped on one side, looking across the water at the imposing army of Porus, with its line of war elephants arrayed like a great gray wall along the bank. A direct, opposed river crossing would be suicidal. The elephants would terrify the horses, and the Indian army would cut the Macedonians to pieces as they struggled ashore. For several weeks, the two armies faced each other across the river in a tense stalemate. Alexander moved his troops up and down the riverbank, making feints and loud displays, trying to lull the Indians into a false sense of security, to make them think his movements were just bluffs.
The battle that followed was one of the most difficult and costly of Alexander's career. At the center of the Indian line were the war elephants. Alexander knew his cavalry would not charge them directly. His strategy was brilliant and complex. He used his horse archers to harass the elephants, and his phalanx to confront them, the disciplined infantrymen jabbing at the animals' eyes and legs with their long sarisas. The battle became a chaotic, bloody melee. The wounded and enraged elephants, driven mad with pain, began to run amok, sometimes crashing back into their own lines, trampling Indian and Macedonian soldiers alike. The rain had turned the plain into a sea of mud, making it difficult for the Indian chariots to maneuver. Alexander himself led his companion cavalry in a series of daring charges, first hitting the Indian left wing, then swinging around to attack their rear. Porus, fighting valiantly from atop the largest elephant, was a tower of strength, directing his troops and fighting with incredible bravery. But he was slowly being surrounded. The Macedonian army, with its superior discipline and combined arms tactics, gradually gained the upper hand. Eventually, Craterus, seeing that the battle was turning in Alexander's favor, began to cross the river with the rest of the army, sealing the Indian defeat. The battle was won, but the cost had been high. The Macedonians had never faced such a difficult and terrifying enemy. Porus, wounded but unbowed, was captured and brought before Alexander. Alexander, who always respected a brave opponent, asked him how he wished to be treated. Porus's famous reply was simple and proud. "Treat me, Alexander, as a king." Alexander was so impressed by his courage and dignity that he not only gave Porus his kingdom back, but also added more territory to it, making him a loyal ally. He had won the battle, but the ferocity of the fight had left a deep impression on his men. They had seen the armies of India, and they had seen the elephants, and they began to wonder what other, even more terrifying forces lay ahead in this vast, endless land.
The army refuses to march on. After the hard-won victory at the Hydaspes, Alexander's desire to push eastward was undiminished. He heard tales of the great kingdoms that lay beyond, of the mighty Ganges River, and of the great outer ocean that he still believed lay just beyond the next horizon. For him, the quest was not over. He was ready to lead his army once more into the unknown. But his men did not share his limitless ambition. They had reached their breaking point. Imagine the scene at the banks of another great Indian river, the Hyphasis, the modern Bias. The army is assembled, but there is no eagerness in the soldiers' eyes, no excitement for a new campaign. There is only a deep, weary silence. For 8 long years they had followed this king, their king, from the hills of Macedon to the plains of India. They had crossed mountains and deserts, fought in great battles and bloody sieges. They were rich with plunder, their bodies were scarred, and their hearts were heavy with a profound homesickness. The monsoons were relentless, the climate was oppressive, and the stories they heard from the locals were not of the ocean, but of even vaster empires, of even larger armies with thousands more of the terrifying war elephants.
They had seen the army of Porus, and they had barely defeated it. The thought of facing forces 10 times that size was too much to bear. They had reached the edge, not of the world, but of their own endurance. The grumbling and discontent that had been simmering for years finally boiled over into open refusal. The men simply would not go any further. It was a mutiny, not a violent one, but a quiet, stubborn, and collective act of defiance. Their spirit was broken. They wanted to go home.
Alexander was stunned and then enraged. He could not comprehend their refusal. How could they stop now when they were so close to the ultimate prize? He went before the assembled army and gave a powerful, impassioned speech. He reminded them of their shared glories, of the victories they had won, of the riches they had gained. He spoke of the eternal fame that awaited them if they would just go a little further. He cajoled, he promised, he threatened. He appealed to their courage, their loyalty, their greed. But this time, his legendary charisma failed him. The men stood silent, their faces set, their eyes on the ground. Then, an old veteran officer named Conus, who had served Alexander faithfully in every battle, stepped forward to speak on behalf of the army. With the utmost respect, but with a firm and unwavering voice, he laid out their case. He spoke of their exhaustion, of their dwindling numbers, of the men they had lost and the wounds they had suffered. He spoke of their longing to see their parents, their wives, and their children again. He urged Alexander to lead them back, to enjoy the empire he had won, and to let a new generation of younger Macedonians undertake any future conquests. A noble thing, O king, is to know when to stop. When he finished, a great cheer of approval rose from the ranks. Alexander, seeing that their resolve was unbreakable, was devastated. He felt betrayed and abandoned. In a final, desperate attempt to change their minds, he retreated to his tent and sulked for 3 days, refusing to see anyone, hoping that his absence would make them relent. But the army did not budge. Their decision was made. Finally, defeated not by an enemy army, but by the will of his own men, Alexander emerged from his tent. He offered sacrifices to the gods, and when the omens proved unfavorable for crossing the river, a convenient and face-saving excuse, he finally, reluctantly, gave the order. They would turn back. He commanded that 12 massive stone altars be built on the banks of the river, altars to the 12 Olympian gods, to mark the farthest point of his advance. They were monuments to a great conquest, but also tombstones for a dream. The dream of conquering the entire world had ended here, not in a glorious battle, but in the quiet, weary refusal of an army that simply could not go on.
The long march home. The decision to turn back was met with joyous celebration by the army, but the journey home would prove to be one of the most harrowing and deadly episodes of Alexander's entire career. He was not a man to simply retrace his steps. He decided to return to Persia by a different, unexplored route. He divided his army into 3 parts. One portion, under the command of Craterus, would take a northern route back through the mountains. A second part would sail down the Indus River and then west along the unknown coast of the Indian Ocean, a voyage of exploration led by his admiral, Nearchus. Alexander himself, with the main body of the army, would march overland, following the coastline to support the fleet. The path he chose would take him directly through the Gedrosian Desert, a vast, barren, and utterly inhospitable wasteland in what is now southern Pakistan and Iran. The local guides had warned him that the journey was impossible, that no army had ever successfully crossed it. But Alexander, perhaps in a fit of pique after the mutiny, perhaps driven by his unending desire to conquer even nature itself, decided to attempt it anyway. The march through the Gedrosian Desert became a 60-day nightmare, a catastrophe that would cost him more men than any battle he had ever fought. Imagine the scene, a vast, endless expanse of shimmering sand and rock under a merciless, blazing sun. There is no shade, no vegetation, and, most critically, no water. The fine, soft sand made marching incredibly difficult, the soldiers sinking up to their knees with every step. The supply wagons, their wheels bogged down in the sand, had to be abandoned early on, meaning the army had to march with only the food they could carry.
The heat was extreme during the day, but the nights were deceptively cold. The soldiers and the thousands of women and children who followed the army began to die in droves. They died of heat stroke, of exhaustion, and, above all, of thirst. The desert was a silent, relentless enemy. The wells they had hoped to find were either dry or brackish. The supplies they had arranged for the fleet to deliver along the coast never materialized, as the fleet itself was struggling against contrary winds. The march became a desperate struggle for individual survival. Discipline, which had been the hallmark of the Macedonian army, completely broke down. Men would slaughter the pack animals for food, then lie about them dying of exhaustion. When a rare well was found, soldiers would fight and kill each other in their desperate frenzy to get to the water. The desert was littered with the bodies of those who could not keep up. Through it all, Alexander shared the hardships of his men. He refused to ride his horse, marching on foot with his soldiers. In one famous incident, when a small amount of water was found and brought to him in a helmet, he looked at the thirsty faces of his men watching him, and then, without drinking, he poured the precious water onto the sand. It was a gesture that said, "Your suffering is my suffering." The act, more than any speech, revived the morale of the dying army, inspiring them to push on. When they finally staggered out of the desert and reached the fertile region of Carmania, the army was a shadow of its former self. Tens of thousands had perished. It was a victory of sorts. They had survived, but it was a victory that felt like a devastating defeat. The long march home had been a brutal, humbling lesson. A stark reminder that there were forces in the world, like the quiet, indifferent power of the desert, that even the greatest conqueror on earth could not defeat with a sword.
The Palace in Babylon. After the horrors of the Gedrosian desert and a period of recovery, Alexander and his battered army finally made their way back to the center of his empire. He returned to the great cities of Persia, Susa, and finally Babylon in the spring of 323 BC. He had been away for over a decade, and in his absence, the vast empire he had conquered had begun to fray at the edges. He found that corruption was rampant. Many of the satraps and governors he had left in charge, both Macedonian and Persian, believing he would never return from the Far East, had abused their power, embezzling funds and ruling as tyrants. Alexander's return was swift and ruthless. He launched a great purge, executing corrupt governors and restoring order with a firm hand. He was no longer just a general. He was the administrator of a world empire, and he spent his final year engaged in the complex and often tedious work of governing. But his restless mind could not stay still for long. Even as he was managing the present, he was already dreaming of the future. The conquest of India may have been thwarted, but there were other worlds to conquer. Imagine him in his palace in Babylon, the same grand halls where he had celebrated his victory years before. But now the mood is different. He is surrounded by architects, engineers, and geographers. Great scrolls and maps are spread out on the tables. His energy, which had been consumed by marching and fighting for so long, was now poured into a flurry of ambitious new plans. His next great project was to be the conquest of Arabia. He saw the Arabian Peninsula as a vital strategic region, controlling the rich trade routes for incense and spices.
he began to assemble a great fleet to circumnavigate the peninsula, ordering the construction of new harbors and the digging of wells along the coast. He planned to lead this expedition himself, to add this last great unconquered part of the old Persian world to his domain.
But his ambitions did not stop there. His gaze also turned west, towards the Mediterranean. He planned expeditions to explore the Caspian Sea, believing it might be connected to the great outer ocean. And there were whispers, grander and more terrifying, of a future campaign against the rising powers of the West, Carthage, Sicily, and perhaps even the fledgling republic on the Tiber River, Rome. He envisioned an empire that would stretch from the Atlantic to the Ganges, a single, unified world state under his rule. He was planning the construction of a great fleet of 1,000 warships and a new coastal road that would stretch all the way from North Africa to the Pillars of Heracles. He also continued his policy of fusion, trying to meld his Macedonian and Persian subjects into a single people. He integrated 30,000 young Persian soldiers who had been trained in the Macedonian style of warfare into the ranks of his army. This move angered his Macedonian veterans, who felt they were being replaced, leading to another near mutiny, which Alexander once again had to quell with a combination of threats and emotional appeals. His final months were a whirlwind of activity. He was planning, building, reorganizing, and dreaming. He commissioned a magnificent funeral pyre for his beloved friend Hephaestion, who had died of a fever. A structure so vast and expensive, it was to be one of the wonders of the world. He was a man who still believed he had an entire lifetime of conquest and creation ahead of him. The scrolls in his palace in Babylon were filled with the blueprints for a future that would never come to be. The great army was being readied. The new fleets were being built, but their commander had reached the end of his own final march.
The final illness. In the late spring of 323 BC, the city of Babylon was hot and humid, the air heavy with the heat rising from the Mesopotamian plains. Alexander, having put down the mutiny of his veterans and finalized the plans for his Arabian campaign, threw himself into a series of religious sacrifices and lavish celebrations. The city was in a festive mood. There were banquets and long, heavy drinking sessions with his companions, a release of tension before the start of a new great enterprise. One evening, Alexander attended a feast hosted by one of his friends. He stayed late, drinking deep, as was his custom. As he was leaving to go to bed, he was invited by another friend, a man named Medius, to a second, more intimate party. Despite being tired and already having drunk a great deal, Alexander agreed. He continued drinking late into the night. The next day, he complained of a fever and aches, but he pushed on, continuing to perform his daily sacrifices and meeting with his commanders to discuss the final details of the coming expedition. But the fever did not break. It grew steadily worse. Imagine the atmosphere in the royal palace slowly changing. The boisterous confidence of the past few days gives way to a quiet, growing concern. The greatest man in the world, a man who had survived countless wounds in battle and had endured the most extreme hardships, was now being laid low by an invisible enemy. The illness was relentless. He was racked with chills, sharp pains, and a debilitating weakness. He was moved to a cooler building near the river, but the fever continued to rise. Soon he was unable to speak. The news of his grave condition spread through the army, and a terrible fear began to grip the soldiers. They had followed this man to the ends of the earth. His life force was the force that held their entire world together. The thought of his death was inconceivable. They demanded to be allowed to see him,
to assure themselves that he was still alive.
A procession was arranged. The doors to his chamber were opened, and his men, the hardened veterans of 100 battles, filed past his bed in a long, silent line. He was too weak to speak, but he acknowledged each man, so the story goes, with a slight nod of his head or a movement of his eyes. It was a final, silent farewell between a king and the army that had made him great. His generals, his companions, the men who had fought alongside him and who now stood to inherit an empire, gathered around him. They knew the end was near. The great question hung in the air. What would happen to the vast, world-spanning empire he had built? Who would rule? According to the most famous account, they asked him the question directly. To whom do you leave your kingdom? Alexander, with his last breath, is said to have whispered a single fateful phrase, "Doi kratistoi," to the strongest. Whether he actually said these words, or if it was a story invented later to justify the brutal wars of succession that followed, we will never know. But on the 10th or 11th of June, 323 BC, in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar II in Babylon, Alexander the Great, king of Macedon, pharaoh of Egypt, king of Asia, son of Amun, died. He was just 32 years old. The cause of his death has been debated ever since. Malaria, typhoid fever, alcohol poisoning, or even assassination by poison. But the cause was less important than the result. The fire that had burned so brightly across the world, the immense, restless energy that had redrawn the map and changed the course of history, was finally extinguished. In the silent, grief-stricken palace, the world held its breath, waiting for the chaos that was sure to follow.
The immortal legacy. The death of Alexander did not bring peace. His final whispered words, whether real or imagined, to the strongest, were a prophecy of war. His vast empire, held together by the sheer force of his personality, had no clear heir. His wife Roxana would give birth to a son soon after his death, but the child was too young to rule. And so his generals, the powerful, ambitious men who had served as his companions, immediately began to vie for power. For the next 40 years, the world that Alexander had conquered was torn apart by the brutal wars of the successors. His body became a political pawn. It was embalmed, placed in a magnificent golden sarcophagus, and was supposed to be sent back to Macedon. But one of his generals, Ptolemy, hijacked the funeral procession and took the body to Egypt, using its immense prestige to legitimize his own rule there. His empire fractured into several large Hellenistic kingdoms: the Ptolemaic kingdom in Egypt, the Seleucid Empire in Persia and the Near East, and the Antigonid dynasty in Macedon. The political unity of his empire was shattered almost as soon as he was gone. And yet, his legacy was far more profound and enduring than the borders of the empire he had built. He had, in a single whirlwind decade, shattered the old world order. He had broken down the barriers between East and West, between Greece and Persia, and had set in motion a cultural exchange that would transform the world. This new era, the era he ushered in, is known as the Hellenistic Age. It was an age of Greek language, Greek art, and Greek ideas, spreading across the vast territories he had conquered. The cities he founded, particularly Alexandria in Egypt, became vibrant cosmopolitan centers of learning and commerce, where Greek philosophers debated with Babylonian astronomers and Egyptian priests. The Greek language became the common tongue of the entire Eastern Mediterranean and the Near East, the language in which trade was conducted, in which science was recorded,
and in which the New Testament of the Christian Bible would one day be written.
He became a figure of myth, a legend who transcended history. His biography, The Alexander Romance, became one of the most popular books of the ancient and medieval world, translated into dozens of languages, its stories embellished with fantastical tales of him flying in a chariot pulled by griffins or descending to the bottom of the sea in a glass submarine. For the Romans who came after, he was the ultimate model of a great commander, a figure to be emulated by generals like Pompey and Julius Caesar. For medieval knights, he was a paragon of chivalry. In Persia, despite having conquered them, he was incorporated into their own legends as a noble, if tragic, figure. His life remains a study in contradictions. He was a brilliant military genius, but also a ruthless conqueror. He was a man of great intellectual curiosity, a student of Aristotle, but also capable of drunken rages and acts of terrible cruelty. He dreamed of a unified world of humanity, but left behind a legacy of war and division. But perhaps his most enduring legacy is the idea he represented, the idea of human potential pushed to its absolute limit. He was a man who took the world as it was and remade it according to his own will. He lived a life of such breathtaking scale and ambition that it still seems scarcely believable. Though the man died in a palace in Babylon and his empire crumbled into dust, the story of his life, of the boy who tamed Bucephalus, who cut the Gordian knot, who marched to the edge of the known world, became immortal. His name echoes down through the ages, a quiet, persistent whisper of the astonishing things a single human life can achieve.